Let's sing together hymn number 30. The God of Abraham praise, who reigns enthroned above. We have just, as many of you will know, had 2 trips to Israel from the fellowship, one at the end of April, going through to the 1st of May, and one which took place during the middle of May. And those of you who have been to Israel will know the experience that it is both to head and to heart. And those of you who haven't been, then tonight is a time for enjoyment of all that the Lord has for us, even if we've never been to Israel. But I've asked John Shee and David McCann, if they'd like to come up and share with us now, just something of what the visit to Israel meant to them. Now, it can mean different things to different people. But particularly John and David I've asked, because I was very much blessed by hearing David share what his views were, and having heard what John has said, I'm sure you're going to be touched by what both say. But it's just an example of how the Lord deals with us as individuals in that lovely way that only He can do, the very personal living God. John, would you like to share first?
On all these excursions with the Millmead Centre, there comes a moment of truth. And what I mean by that is this, that at some stage one is asked frequently, what blessings have you received at this point in this day? We were in the YMCA in Jerusalem, and we were all together, and this question was asked to the group of us. It's quite a difficult thing to put into focus. You think carefully of so many experiences, travelling, companionship, feasting your eyes on many new scenes, an immense variety of experiences. As I sat there and thought about it, I was aware, particularly on this my second trip, that what was happening was something that in fact was curative and healing, and advancing and developing the complete man. It came over me in quite a flash of realization that I was experiencing all these benefits, that in fact for many months I had been going through a period of physical ill health, not very severe, but enough to put me off colour. My reactions in Israel and in Jerusalem were such that I was amazed to find that I suddenly had a new sense of fitness and of purpose. I'd even had the slight misfortune to crack a rib just before going to Israel. And those among you, I feel tempted to ask you to put up your hands. I suspect there are a large number who have cracked a rib, will know that sweet agony of coughing or laughing after that event. We had a doctor with us, and she said to me, what do you want, the good news or the bad news? Actually, I made that up, but she actually said to me, it'll get worse, and then it'll slowly get better, and it'll take 3 weeks. I said, thank you, doctor. And she, by way of comfort, said, aspirin every 2 hours. Just keep the pain down. We sat in a garden, the garden tomb, and there, amidst the dappled sunshine and shade, in that very important place to all of us, we had a communion service. And then, to my surprise and my embarrassment, my name was mentioned as someone in need of healing. I won't tell you how David found out that I needed the healing at this stage. And hands were laid upon me. And we prayed. I made a point of not taking any aspirin, thinking, well, that would hardly be an act of faith. And much to my surprise, and I confess that, to my surprise, I didn't need any aspirin, and I think the doctor herself was extremely surprised to find that when she thought my pains would be most acute, they were not. So when I spoke of the complete man, obviously I had had experience of intellectual blessing. We had had discussions of a political nature with a Sabra, a Jew born in Israel, who was very politically minded. We had seen many beautiful things. We had shared many deep spiritual moments. And I could say truthfully that the complete man was benefiting. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. David, would you like to share? And then we have the other David after you.
Okay. Hilary and I never thought we would go to Israel. It was quite a surprise to us. About a fortnight, 3 weeks before, David telephoned to say, "Have you ever been? Would you like to go?" There were some other things to be attended to, as you can imagine, but basically the answer was, yes, we'd love to. But perhaps for more than some, there was a feeling of the Lord sending us, but with very little preparation. So of course, we went tremendously keyed up. I was thinking all the time, Lord, what have you sent me here for? What is there here for me? And I expect I was looking for a rapport, somehow or other, that when I reached Israel, that I would find a rapport with the people or with the countryside, and was disappointed when I didn't. I hope David won't mind, but one of my memories of that trip is going to be driving along in that coach, David coming down with one arm on each of the chairs, and as he walked down, we were looking out through the window, and there we were passing the Valley of Eshcol. You remember the spies going in and bringing back the tremendous grapes? But to someone born in the north of Ireland, when David comes along and says, "Look, isn't it fertile?" That epitomizes a lot of my feelings. Lord, why? What is so special about this country? It is beautiful, it is varied, but there are more beautiful places, or as beautiful, to my eyes. Jericho is beautiful. It's green, it's lush, and set among the gum trees and acacias and the date palms. It's beautiful. But so is Brisbane or Sydney. If you go to Jerusalem, we walked around Jerusalem. We walked miles in Jerusalem at a very fast pace sometimes. And again, the question kept coming to me, "Lord, what's so special about this city?" It is a nice city, it's beautiful, but again, there are more beautiful, the more lovely locations. Sydney's got a beautiful location. Segovia in Spain is fairy tale with its turrets and castles. What makes this so special? And these people, we saw some of them, our guide, Sabras, Israelis. What makes them? And the Lord just seemed to be saying to me, I've chosen them, and that's why they're special. You don't need any other reason. I chose them. And because I chose them, they're going to be here. Because one of the overwhelming impressions you get as you view ruined city after ruined city, ruins that keep going down in layers, 20 cities, 26 cities deep, you get this tremendous feeling of permanence. God has said, I have placed these people here, I intend them to be here, and they will be here. He is a constant, faithful God. I have chosen you. I want you to see what my physical people Israel are like and what I can do for them. So, for my spiritual people, I have chosen them also, and I will build them. Many impressions, but most of all, God chose them, and because He chose them, we need no other reason. Thank you.
I'm going to speak later on a serious aspect of Israel, but talking it over, it seemed right just to share with you a few of the experiences I had in between groups. It was a real bonus to be out there in between groups. I had been planned to be in the county hospital between those two visits, and then the doctor there wanted a holiday, so since every appointment here was already fixed up and covered, I'm afraid I nipped off without permission and had just over a week on my own in Israel. It's a place where you meet everybody sooner or later if you wait there long enough, as those of you who've spent any time there know. And I found that the time in between groups was exciting more for the people I met than for any places I was able to see, though I did go to one or two places that you can't go to on a highly packaged holiday. Let me just pick up one or two. For example, on the Sunday evening I went to a lovely building in Jaffa, which had belonged to Peter Ustinov's grandfather, who ran it as a downtown hotel, and which Peter Ustinov tried to buy back recently. Fortunately, he wasn't able to, and a group of Christians have made it into a lovely house for fellowship, transformed it from the days when Meg and Fred lived in a top floor there, I think. And you wouldn't recognize it. We had a lovely service, about 80 or 90 people there, and in the middle of the sermon, the wife of the Brazilian consul in Israel was wonderfully healed. She was obviously a very sick woman, and the Lord just met her right in the middle of the sermon and just healed her, head to toe. And she just had to get up and share this testimony. Well, now, I've said you meet everybody there sooner or later, so guess who I met the following day on the Mount of Olives? Peter Ustinov. Who else? You just walk around and you meet one person after another. I'd come up by bus from Tel Aviv and was reading a pamphlet about the discrimination against those who sought to convert others through bribery and corruption. You may remember the cases or the law that was passed about a year ago. And I was reading a Christian response to this law on the bus, and very troubled about the attitude the ultra-Orthodox members of Parliament were taking towards Christian missionaries in the land. And I noticed on the opposite side of the bus, a man kept looking at what I was reading, so I held it so that he could read the cover, and wondered who he was. And finally, I looked at him straight, and he looked interested, so I went across and sat down by him and said, "Do you mind if I sit here?" And then I said, "Now, who are you?" And he said, "Well, actually, I'm from the Ministry of Religious Affairs." And I said, "Well, what do you do there in the ministry?" He said, "I'm in charge of relationships between Israel and Christian churches." Just the very man to talk to about this discrimination against Christians. And so it went on. It was just quite uncanny, the way one meeting after another. Some of you will recall that I went up to a dear old man on the Dead Sea shore beach who looked the absolute image of Albert Einstein. And I said, "Has anyone ever told you look just like Einstein?" He said, "Yes, and actually I was a friend of his." And in fact, it was fascinating to talk to someone who knew Einstein personally. He also knew the artist, Spiro, who did those pictures down our rear staircase here, who also painted a portrait of Albert Einstein. Wherever you go, you just meet people. But there were two ambitions I had which I fulfilled while I was there, two places to go. One was to a museum in Tel Aviv, which has only just been opened a matter of months. It is the most modern museum in the world. It's an experience. We did it as quickly as we could, and it took us 4 hours. They normally recommend 6 to go through it. And it is a presentation of the diaspora, the dispersion of the Jews, through every modern visual and audio aid you could imagine. And coming through that is something I wish I could take all my parties through, because one came out really ashamed, embarrassed at the Christian attitude to the Jew over the centuries. It is a shameful story, and they have not spared their Christian visitors the full story. And I'm afraid I felt as I came out that the one attitude to the Jews in Israel must not be to preach at them or try and convert them, but must be to comfort them and to speak tenderly to Jerusalem. And that only that will make up or atone for some of the terrible Christian attitudes there have been in the past. But the main experience that I really felt I should have during that time was to go and climb Sinai. And I set off by bus from Jerusalem, traveled about 230 miles for under £2 on an air-conditioned coach, and inflation there is 101%, so it was remarkably cheap, and arrived in the town of Eilat after dark, a place I'd never been before, and the only possible contact I had was I had heard from a man in Tel Aviv of a remarkable Christian couple in that place, quite poor, just living there to be the Lord's presence in Eilat, and he wasn't able to give me their exact address. He said they're somewhere up near the hospital. And so late at night, I first checked in at the youth hostel to see if they had a bed, and they had, so I could go back to them if I was really stuck. But I set off up the road and climbed the hill towards the big hospital. Got about 2/3 of the way up the hill and said, Lord, would you please tell me where they live? I just don't know. Please tell me. And as clear as a flash, I knew I had to walk to a certain block of flats on the other side of the road. So I walked over and with a torch looked at the names on the bell pushers, and the bottom name, which happened to be the top flat, was the name of this couple. So I went upstairs wondering how to introduce myself. And I knocked at the door, and this couple came. There were 3 little children behind them in the main living room. And they came to the door, and they just stood there, and they said, welcome, come on in. We've got your bedroom ready. I said, has someone phoned ahead? And they said, no, we're not on the phone. I said, how did you know I was coming? They said, well, while we prayed this morning, the Lord said very clearly, I am sending someone to bless you, so get a bedroom ready. And so they said, we've got our bedroom ready for you. I said, where are you going to sleep? And they said, right here in the dining room. Well, their bedroom was on the floor, so they were on the floor in the dining room too, and I didn't feel that I was putting them to undue hardship. But wasn't that a lovely welcome? The Lord had just gone before us, and later in the evening, my, did the Lord bless that couple. He really did bless them so well that we had a lovely time together. Then I set off by bus for Sinai. It is the roughest, hardest bus journey I have ever taken. It started at 5 in the morning, and we got there at 6:30 at night. And the last 100 miles were over rock. We went right down one side of Sinai Peninsula to Sharm el-Sheikh, and then right up the Suez side, about halfway to where the Egyptian oil wells are, and then we cut back into Sinai. Now, I was the only Christian on the bus as far as I could see, and since the seats were numbered, I had a blank seat next to me for the journey there. The rest of the people on the bus, about 25, were mostly German tourists or Jewish visitors from other lands. There were 2 French Orthodox whose main interest was in icons, and they were coming to the Mount Caterina or the St. Caterina Monastery to look at the icons. When we got to the monastery very late at night, after having burst 2 tires and having walked part of the way that Moses led the children of Israel, we arrived at this very simple, rough hostel. There were small rooms about 12 feet square, and each of them held 10 or 12 people in double bunks with just a foot of space between them. And the arrangements were, well, adequate but primitive. And we arrived there after dark, and there was some mix-up about misinformation. The wrong numbers of men and women had been sent ahead. So the guide the person in charge of the party got a little upset, and he was saying, now come on, we'll sort it out. 12 men in there, 10 women in there. Hurry up, come on. And he was pushing them about, and I sensed that the emotional temperature was rising very quickly. So I just tried to get in there and do something and try and help and calm down and say to someone, look, you can have my bed if you haven't got somewhere, let's get you in, and just tried to be helpful. It wasn't until the next day when we left Sinai that a lady came and sat next to me in the bus seat, and she was the first of about 12 to come and do so. And she just said this. She said, did you realize what was happening last night? Did you realize why we were so upset? I said, no. Well, she said, can you imagine? I and my husband both came out of concentration camps. He was in Stadthausen, I was in Buchenwald. And she said, we got there after dark, and suddenly the guide said, men this side, women that side. And then we were being pushed into rooms with bunks that far apart in the dark. And she said, did you realize? We were just right back in the concentration camp. And that's why we were so upset. And then she said something that really shook me, because if you know me, I'm not a placid person at all. And we're known as the party that runs where Jesus walked, as I'm sure you've heard. Nevertheless, in spite of that, she said this question, and maybe it was because I hadn't got a party with me, but she said this, tell me, where do you get your peace? Now, I wasn't conscious of that at all, but she said, you've been radiating peace since you got on this bus, and I want to know where you get it. What is there about you that's different from us? And she was the first of 12 to come and ask the same question. It really hits you when you realize you've been witnessing without trying to do so, or even conscious of doing so. But Jewish people are very shrewd people, and they see straight through, and they can sum up. That's why a friend whom I made during this trip, by name of Dr. Larry Samuels, the professor of nuclear medicine in Hadassah Hospital, who was the man who led Golda Meir to Christian faith before she died, and who is praying regularly with Menachem Begin now. He was Swedish by descent, and his parents went to America with the name of Svensson. And the Americans can't say Svensson very easily, so his father decided to change the family name to Samuels, and he chose it just out of the blue like that. So he gave his son a Jewish name. The son became a very fine doctor in nuclear medicine, specialist, and then he had a terrible car crash and became a cabbage and a cripple. His career over. But his wife and he felt that the one thing they needed to do was to get to Jerusalem. They'd never been. And they managed to get him on a plane, they got him to Jerusalem, and he met up with some Christians meeting there. And he said, Lord, if you can do anything with this body of mine, I'll do anything at all that you tell me. And within 1 week, he was completely healed. Completely. And so he said, right, Lord, where do you want me to go? And the Lord said, I want you to stay right here in Jerusalem and apply to the Hadassah Hospital for a job. And within 1 year, he was made professor of nuclear medicine, a position that normally requires 15 years' experience in Jerusalem. And so there he was. But when he went in for the first interview, the Jewish consultant looked straight at him and said, well, Dr. Samuels, your name is Jewish, but your eyes are Christian. How come? I mention that again as yet another illustration of the fact that you are probably saying more without your lips than you manage to say with them. Well, that experience of talking to so many who had been in concentration camps in the presence of a bus half full of German tourists was a unique experience. And I found the Lord just had opened their hearts and opened their ears. And I just speak the honest truth when I say it was more thrilling to talk to those people on the bus than to climb Mount Sinai. Climb Mount Sinai I did, 3 o'clock in the morning, 3,000 steps, averaging 12 inches each. It's quite a pull. If you want to go and do it, then I recommend you really get into training before you go. But sitting on the top of Mount Sinai by oneself and just looking out over that terribly barren area, and then coming down and clattering our way over the rocks through these barren valleys, the thought that really came to me and the message that I felt I needed to bring back from that area was this. They needn't have been here. They needn't have been here for more than 2 weeks. And my mind went back to the Museum of the Diaspora in Tel Aviv. They needn't have been dispersed either. And those dreadful experiences that are commemorated in the museum, and that terrible, hot, dry wilderness where we were so dehydrated we just had to drink liters of water to keep going. They needn't have been in either of those experiences, but they were in both through disobedience. And I came home with this burning conviction: the Lord is calling his people in this country to get in and possess the land. And I know that if we don't, over the next 3 to 4 years, we are going to live in such a spiritual wilderness. We are going to be so dispersed. I see no future for the Christian church unless, over the next few years, we really go in and take what God tells us to take, and take the initiative. Those of you here on Tuesday would know that I took the liberty of writing to Mrs. Thatcher 2 days before she became Prime Minister to tell her that the Lord was giving her the job, and then had the later privilege of speaking to Menachem Begin on the way home from Israel, and in a sense encouraging them both towards each other. Because again, I believe firmly that God is giving this land another chance to do something for Israel to make up for the way we have treated her over the past. Well, these were just a few of the experiences that came my way during those days in between. Others I'll no doubt share with you from time to time. I'll be back later in the service with a more serious word about what we can learn from Israel.
Makes you want to go out there all over again, doesn't it? I've only just come back. Hymn number 406, Jerusalem the Golden.
Let me say first that in sharing what we do with you when we come back from Israel, it is never intended that this should make you envious or jealous. Rather, to share with you the blessings we have and the insights that come. But I would put in not a commercial, but a plea that you seriously consider going to Israel, if you possibly can. It may be that you could start saving up now for the next time we go. Or, and here I'm speaking to those who could more easily afford to go, would you consider praying about saving up for someone else to go? Someone who otherwise might never have the chance to. I keep saying that 1 fortnight in Israel is worth at least 2 months in a Bible college. But there are other things that are learned out there that can only be learned out there. And this church has proved again and again that those who bless Israel will be blessed. And it has done nothing but bring blessing to our church to have so many of you go out there. Could I just see how many of you now have been? That's a fair sprinkling right through. Well, I hope that others of you will very seriously consider this as an investment of a lifetime. Let me read a few verses from the first chapter of the first letter of John. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, and our hands have touched, This we proclaim concerning the word of life. The life appeared, and we have seen and testified to it, and we proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and has appeared to us. And we proclaim to you what we have seen and heard, so that you also may have fellowship with us. And our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. And we write this to make your joy complete. What we've seen, heard, and touched, we share with you to make your joy complete. Tonight is the first of at least 2 and maybe more talks about Israel. There are so many aspects to this wonderful land, and tonight I want to talk about the place and try and explain the strange effect that the place has on our faith. A fortnight tonight, June the 10th, I hope to be speaking on the people, looking at some of the amazing ways in which God has had his hand on this people, even during the last 2,000 years, and has prepared them for what is happening now in Israel. The story is so full of coincidence, irony, staggering facts, that you can only come to the conclusion that either this is the most unusual story there ever was, or God is still alive and busy in his world. But that's a fortnight tonight. Tonight I want to look at the place, and people go to the place for many reasons. Some people go simply because it's becoming more popular, and the rate of tourists is increasing every year in Israel. That's a good thing for their economy, which depends now first on diamond cutting, second on tourism, and third on citrus fruits. Tourism has now beaten fruit to second place for dollar earners in Israel. And so it is important. And I was thrilled to hear, I believe God has his hand on Freddie Laker. And I was thrilled to hear that next year Freddie Laker is starting cheap flights to Israel. That's his next big venture. I think the hand of God is on that, in getting more and more people there to where the action is and to get the feel of that place. So some people go because it's getting more popular. Other people go there to see places that they've heard or read about for so many years that they've kind of had a built-up curiosity to see, and to see if they really come up to expectations, which some of them don't. Others go there with the more serious purpose of studying the Bible more intelligently and getting insights that they otherwise couldn't get, especially in a short space of time. And some just go to have an interesting holiday. It's a treat they've promised themselves all their life. And so you get a fairly high average age among most of the tourist groups, retired people giving themselves a last trip. In fact, in our first party, some of the older ones were called Jerry by the younger ones, short for geriatric. It was one of those little endearing terms that nobody minded. And the leader of the Jerrys I can see staring at me right now. And he was the youngest of them all, weren't you? Well, now, I want to say straight away that there is no magical effect on a person's relationship to the Lord by going to Israel. Just as there are would-be missionaries who think that when they step off the plane or the ship in the country to which God has sent them, they will be quite transformed. They'll be able to minister, they'll be able to do all kinds of things, and then come to that rude awakening and realize that they're exactly the same as the person who got on. So there are those who fondly imagine that when they get to Israel, somehow their relationship with the Lord will magically be transformed and become wonderful. I tell you from personal experience, your relationship with the Lord there will be the same as your relationship with him here. And what you get from that land will depend very much on the relationship with him that you took there. There will be things happen that will affect that relationship, but they are not magical things. There's nothing magic about the land to give you a sudden spiritual boost or a bless-up. But your faith will undergo a very subtle change, and it's that change that I want to describe tonight. Some people have said something like this. People in this congregation have said it. I don't see why you need to go to Israel. My faith is strong here. I can find the Lord perfectly well here. I've got a relationship with him that's close and warm. He's with me every day in the back garden, in the shop, in the office. Why do I need to go there? Well, if you've got a real relationship like that with the Lord here, praise the Lord. But there is still a dimension from which your faith could benefit. And I want to try and spell this out. That depends on going to the place. It's a unique place. And if you ask me what this place does for you, I would say in a sentence, though I'll then have to explain it over quite some time, it is the place where you can get it together. It's the place where you can get it together. It's a unique place because it's a place where things are together. And one of the first surprises that people get when they go there is how small and how compact and how compressed and how varied that little land is. 150 miles long, 50 miles wide, the size of Wales, a population of 3 million plus. And in that little land, every corner you turn brings you to a new piece of country, a totally different environment. From Jerusalem, you can go one way along the Judean hills and see that lovely valley of Eshcol referred to earlier. Not as fertile as the Emerald Isle, but a very beautiful valley. Or you can turn left and immediately you're in the barren, dry wilderness and going right down to that great crack in the earth's surface, the Rift Valley, which goes from Lebanon right to Tanzania in Africa. Or you can turn the other way and you can be down in country that is like the Lincolnshire Downs, the part that is most like England. Or you can head north and within a short time be in sight of snow ski slopes, towering 10,000 feet in the air. Or you can go to the coast and you can drive down the slopes of Carmel through a place which is called Little Switzerland because it is so like Switzerland. It's as if God has taken a little bit of the whole world and put it right there within one little land. It's as if he's compressed the whole world into that land. It's a unique experience to drive around it. Every few miles you are in a different country. We had the privilege, each party this time, of hearing Lance Lambert speak on the uniqueness of the land. And Lance Lambert is a unique person, as you know. He is Jewish. His parents did not survive the concentration camp. He is a bachelor and therefore has plenty of time to study birds and animals and plants. And has he studied them? My, to hear him talk. You see, Israel is the northernmost limit of African animals, birds and plants. It is the easternmost limit of European birds, animals and plants, and it's the westerly limit of Asian birds, animals and plants. And it's quite unique to realize that, again, all those trees and animals and birds are compressed, compacted into one little land. I stood and looked at the plain of Gennesaret, which borders on the towns of Capernaum and Chorazin. And that little triangle of land is quite unique. It's barely half a mile across, and yet it has one unique property. It will grow any plant from any part of the world. And if you study the plants there, you'll find tropical and temperate plants growing perfectly happily side by side. You'll find plants that need a damp soil and plants that need a dry soil growing side by side. In that little triangle through which our Lord's feet pass so often, you can find plants growing from all over the world, just in that little area. Now, all this begins to help us to put it together. And places that we'd heard about and had in our minds, which never quite tied up, gradually take their place in the jigsaw until the picture is complete. And you begin to feel, that's why it happened there. And he just needed to walk 10 minutes from Jerusalem to be in the wilderness and to be tempted. Oh, and that's why that battle took place in that valley. And you begin to put it together. There's a great advantage in this, because after a bit you ask this funny question. Did these events happen in those places because of the geography, or was the geography made for those events to happen there? Because so many times you realize that is the only place that could have happened, that you begin to ask this question, is it a coincidence that the land was perfectly shaped and developed for everything that God wanted to do in it? And I come back to the conclusion and back to a vision almost of God creating the world, but taking special care with his fingers to make that little land, cracking the great Rift Valley to have the lowest point on the earth's surface for his son to be baptized, making those mountains which would either be pulpits for prophets, or his son the greatest prophet, or reminders of blessings and curses, shaping those valleys so that they could go in and take the land, causing the main wind to come from the west so that it would bring the rain and make one half of the land very fertile indeed, causing a land to have such a climate that there was a heavy dew so that those lovely grapes could grow right through the summer season when there was no rain. All these things make me feel that this place is special because God made it and made every little detail of it just right for everything he was going to do. Each setting was like a stage which God managed for the event that was to take place. It really is quite astonishing when you begin to look at the land from that point of view. That event didn't take place because the land was like that, but the land was like that because that event was going to take place. It turns around your whole understanding of creation, not as a chance thing, but as a very choice thing in which God was shaping the land according to his own purposes. These contrasts of snow to sand and plateau to ravine and woods to wilderness, you will find nowhere else in the world. You'll find each type of country somewhere else, blown up on a large scale. You'll find more spectacular scales of these features elsewhere. But this is the most beautiful of all lands because it combines a land in which everybody can at some place feel at home. And it is true that anyone who comes there, whatever part of the world they come from, at one point in Israel they will say, well, this is just like home. And it's as if God has made a land where the world will be welcome, and one day all the nations of the world will go up and they'll grab hold of a Jew and say, teach us about your God. I'm going to divert for a moment there because one of the men I met, I had supper with a very interesting Jewish man called Rosenstein, and he quoted poetry at me in 7 languages. I just felt completely ignorant by the end of the evening. He could talk about any subject you raised. He could talk about science, about music, about art, about literature. He could talk about nature. He was an amazing man. He had been the curator of the Theodor Herzl Museum on Mount Herzl for many years. He now taught Hebrew as a living. I'd love to learn from him because he was sharing Hebrew thought and not just Hebrew language. But towards the end of the evening, I found myself doing something unconsciously and then realizing it too late. I got hold of his knee and I was holding his trousers. And I didn't realize I was doing this, and I said, you know, you can lead the world in every sphere except one. The world is just waiting for you to lead us in knowledge of God. When are you going to be able to teach us about God? And I suddenly realized I had hold of his trousers. And I let go of them. And then I remembered that text that the days will come when people will seize the skirt of a Jew and say, tell us about your God. Teach us. If they can get this missing link, they will lead the world. There's no question about that. Jews have been accused of many things, but they've never been accused of being lazy. And they lead the world in every other sphere. But I'm jumping to my subject a fortnight tonight. Let's get back to the place. God worked out his purposes in a very small area for the most part. Most of the Bible comes from that tiny land, and to go out there is to begin to get it together and to see where the mountains are in relationship to each other, to see how near everything is, to see how Jesus could walk from Galilee to Jerusalem and back again, to see it all in its setting. But that's not what I mean basically by getting it together. It's a start. The second area in which Israel is so compact and so compressed is the area of time. It is not only a country in which space is compressed, with all these different types of country within such a short range, it's a country in which time has been compressed, so that 2,000 years ago is yesterday and 4,000 years ago is the day before. I know of no other place that has this effect on you. Indeed, it's fascinating and amusing to watch the group become gradually bemused by history. By the third day, you point out a building, a magnificent watchtower in Jericho, built 9,000 years ago, with every stone still in place, and they just go, And you realize they're just punch-drunk with history. There is one little spot in Galilee, up above Capernaum, where you can stand on a little hill, and from that hill you can point out 12,000 years of history, beginning with a 10,000-year-old cave where prehistoric man was found right at your feet, moving right through Old Testament history, right through New Testament history and all that Jesus did at the foot of that little hill, Then you can come through the middle, through the Roman conquests and the Roman put down of the Bar Kokhba revolt in the caves above. Then you can point to the Crusader period, the Horns of Hittin, where Salah ad-Din finally conquered the Crusaders. And you can come right up to date and finally point to the electric power station at your feet, which pumps water from Galilee to the Negev. And from one spot you have compassed 12,000 years of history, and there's a lot more to it than I've just given you. It's almost unnerving to go around Jerusalem and to keep scrambling down under Jerusalem and seeing the Roman pavements and streets, and you can almost imagine the gladiators just walking up. And to be able to I picked up a Canaanite goddess from, she was dead. She was, things, family news. She gave me the cold shoulder because she was stoned. But I just picked that up off the floor, off the ground at Megiddo. I knew it was around 4,000 years old. And you have to shake your head and realize that that's just yesterday out there. There's a very long memory out there. I remember sitting on Mount Tabor with a young Israeli, and he was saying, now Deborah came up here to the top of Mount Tabor, and Barak came up to her here, and our troops were gathered around here, and the enemy were down there, and our troops charged down this way, and Sisera's chariots were caught just down there where you can see the water. And he was describing it as if he'd been an eyewitness. When we stood at Hebron and looked down at the catafalques above the tombs of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Leah and Isaac and Rebekah, Abraham and Sarah, as we looked at those tombs, I just reminded the party, look, God is not the God of the dead, He's the God of the living. I am the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And suddenly, 4,000 years of history seemed to vanish. It takes a lot of getting used to this. I watched the party's faces as the guide talked about the Ottomans and the Hasmoneans and the Byzantines and the Maccabeans, and they were just writing notes down, and I could see on their faces, must try and look that up when I get home. But 15 civilizations have occupied Jerusalem alone and gone. 15. And yet it's still there, and it's all piled on top of each other in heaps of ruin and rubble. But not only the past comes very much into your present thinking in Israel, there's also a compression of the future into the present. To stand at Megiddo and look around and see what Churchill called the cockpit of the Middle East and realize that the last battle of the final world war of history will take place right there. You can see it. It's a natural battlefield. It's the crossroads of the world. It's the way through those mountains from Africa to Asia and Asia to Europe and Europe to Africa. It's where the world's forces will meet, as they have done again and again right up to Allenby in World War I. And suddenly the future is very real. Or the first morning when we stood on the Mount of Olives and realized that we were standing in the very place where one day all of you will be. You're all going to take a trip to the Holy Land by air and not by El Al, which means every landing always late. But without, you're going to meet the Lord in the air. And to sing Jesus is coming again on the Mount of Olives, suddenly the future seems very close to you. So past, present, and future get compressed and compacted together, as Jerusalem is a city that is compacted together. Well, now all this compression and compacting means that you can begin to get things together. Mind you, can't do it in one visit. That's not a commercial, it's just a statement of fact. The more you go, the more you get together, the more you see God's purposes holding together. The more you understand something that someone has called the scandal of particularity. I've used that phrase from this pulpit occasionally. Let me explain it again. The scandal of particularity means that God, in His wisdom, chose a particular place and a particular period and a particular people to do what was needed to be done on earth. And this is a scandal to others. Why should He choose that place? Isn't England good enough? Why should He choose that period? Isn't the 20th century the best century yet? Why should He choose that people? Who are these Jews anyway? The scandal of particularity. I've often tried to explain it by saying that, putting it this way, I used to bring sweets for my 3 children when I remembered. weekly, and there are 2 ways in which I could bring them. I could either bring 3 separate bars or packets and give 1 to each child, or I could bring 1 packet and say, now divide those out among you. Now the first way would guarantee peace. The second way didn't. But the second way would establish relationships, would reveal what relationships there were as well, whether they were good or bad that day. Now here is God, and He wants to bless the whole world. He wants to bless the Americans and the British and the Chinese and the Russians and the Africans. He wants to bless everybody. So how does He do it? Does He give a blessing to America, a blessing to England? Why didn't He send His Son to each of these places? No, God said, Abraham, I'm going to bless all the families of the earth in you. I'm going to give it to you and you share it. That will create a family of nations for me. Now you see God's plan? It is a scandal to some. It is an offense to others. It is even an offense to the Jews themselves. Coming back from Eilat on the bus, I found myself next to a girl officer of the Israeli army. She had just become an officer and was clearly going through a crisis. And I said, well, if you want to talk, I'm happy to talk. Well, she said, since you're a stranger, I won't meet you again. I'm willing to talk. And you know what her problem was? Her problem was that a recent piece of archaeology, which had been publicized on television and in the papers, had proved that she was a direct descendant of King Solomon. Now, what crisis had this brought on? She said, I don't want to be special. I wish I wasn't one of the chosen people. And she was really angry at what some of you would have counted a great privilege, to be a direct descendant of King Solomon. And I met other Jews who told me, I wish I wasn't one of the chosen. Why can't we be just ordinary human beings? Why have we to be special? Well, God says you have to be special because I've chosen you. I've given to you what I want to give to the world. And it is their calling to lead the world. I'm quite sure Prince Charles sometimes feels, I wish I hadn't been born to my mother. But he has been born to lead this people. And he can either get angry about it or he can prepare for that calling. That's the trouble of being called. You either rebel against it or you prepare yourself for it. But it doesn't leave you much option, does it? And so there is this scandal of particularity that God made that land as it was, and He made those people and He put them in it, and He said, I'm going to work through you to the rest of the world. This is my great plan, and it still is His plan. And my Bible was written by over 40 different authors over a period of 1,500 years in at least 3 different languages, but every writer was a Jew except one. And my Jesus is Jewish. And every blessing that really means anything in my life came to me through Jewish hands. How odd of God to choose the Jews, but odder still for those who choose the Jewish God and scorn the Jews. Well, now I still haven't got to my main point. I've tried to show you how you begin to get it together, because in that land space is very compact and compressed. You also begin to get it together because time is also compressed. And because time is compressed, you can see more clearly the eternal purposes of God working themselves out. I find that when I go to Israel, I get a clearer sense of God's historical purposes being worked out than in any other country in the world. Because you've got that longer time scale, and God doesn't do things by next Thursday. God is a very patient God. The mills of God grind slowly, but they grind exceeding small. And so there you get a perspective with that compressed country and that compressed period of time. You can see more clearly what God is about. And you can see more clearly back in your own land what God is doing, because you've seen it in that compressed example of His amazing power and inscrutable wisdom. I'll speak more about His amazing wisdom with His people a fortnight tonight. Now let me get right to the point of what do I mean by getting it together. I mean that in that land where space and time are so compressed, you can get together the spiritual and the physical. It is the one place in the world where these two can be integrated. Nowhere else do you find this. throughout the Oriental world in the East and throughout the Occidental world in the West, the spiritual and the physical have drifted so far apart that we cannot somehow get them together. And in the East, it is the spiritual that has come out on top and the material has not. It is fast catching up with Western influence upon it. But nevertheless, in the East, all parts east of Suez, the spiritual comes up on top and the material is underneath. West of Suez, the materials come out on top and the spiritual is underneath. But in both cases, they are so far apart you can't put them together. It is only right in the middle, in this little land with all its compressed history and all its compressed space, that you can actually get the physical and the spiritual put together. And it is vital to do so because, as Archbishop William Temple said during World War II, Christianity is the most materialistic of all the world religions. And you know why? Because it's the most Western. All the other major religions began east of Israel. And so they are all spiritualistic religions. Isn't it strange that now we're swapping sides and the Eastern mystics and gurus are coming to the West and the Western technologists are going to the East? What an extraordinary upset. But still we haven't got it together. And it seems as if we cannot hold together the physical or the spirit and the spiritual in our lives. One dominates the other. One takes over from the other. And either we become so materialist that the spiritual cannot get in, or we become so spiritual that we're utterly impracticable. Now let's look at how this gets together in Israel. Or rather, let's look at how we separate these two in the Western world. We divide our lives into the sacred and the secular, a division that is never made in the Bible anywhere. Yet we talk about sacred callings and secular callings. We talk about sacred activities and secular activities. The Hebrew would never talk like that. The words sacred and secular do not belong in the Hebrew language. They have no equivalent. We divide up our life into the supernatural and the natural. And these two are so far apart, we find it very difficult to get them together. And so our culture disintegrates because the spiritual and the physical get too far apart. And one takes over from the other. The only place I know where you can get those together again properly is in Israel. The place where the Word was made flesh. The place where God stepped into history and the supernatural became the natural and the sacred invaded the secular and the heavenly invaded the earthly, and they got it together. Jesus got it together in his own person. The physical and the spiritual were one. And it could only have happened in Israel because it always had been that way. I want to develop this now. The fact that in Hebrew thinking there is no gap or gulf between the physical and the spiritual. It is the gap between these two things that prevents us so often from living a whole life. A whole life. We tend to live in departments because we can't get it together. Let's look at 4 areas in behavior where we seem unable to get it together. I mentioned first sex. When God made sex, he looked at it and he said, that's very good. That's very good. And there is one book in my Bible, almost in the middle of it, right central to this book, which is a love song, a sexual love song between a man and a woman in love. And we don't know what to do with that bit of scripture. We spiritualize it. We read all kinds of devotional meanings into it. They are valid, but only in a secondary sense. If we make those meanings the primary interpretation, then we have not got the physical and the spiritual together. Now, I was thrilled to find while I was in Israel that there is a project to produce the Song of Solomon or Song of Songs in photographs. Already they've spent 600,000 Israeli lira on it. And they've taken 10,000 pictures. And this is what the Tel Aviv Media Contemporary Arts who are producing it said. Of course, we started out thinking it was erotic. But as we read the poem over and over and discussed it, we moved to a more esoteric understanding. In the Song of Songs, the relationship between men and women is beautiful, the way it should be, with all the purity and all the feelings that exist. Now, I take that as one example of an area in which the physical and the spiritual have got so far apart that still to this day many Christian couples getting married cannot somehow see their physical union as a spiritual thing, as something that God wants and that is lovely and that which He intended. Take another example of our disintegration, the matter of Christian attitude to culture. When I spent that evening with Rosenstein, there were 2 other Christians present, and the 3 of us were talking with him. And his interests and cultures were so broad, I've already admitted, that we were really left behind totally as ignoramuses by his incredible education. But at least I did try to keep up and try and ask intelligent questions about the fascinating subjects he was raising. I noticed very sadly that the other 2 Christians with me, if they couldn't talk about Jesus, couldn't talk about anything. I find that sad. For in Israel is the richest culture in the world, as I'll expand on in a fortnight's time. You've got people who've come back from every kind of music, every kind of art, and they've brought it back with them, and they've brought the treasures of the nations into Jerusalem just to go to the artist's colony or to go to the House of Quality. To go to the art museums and galleries is such a precious experience because they've brought back all this rich culture to Jerusalem. And yet many Christians, because the physical and the spiritual are too far apart, have got out of touch with any real culture and have very little to say. I'm thrilled that Hallelujah song won the Eurovision Song Contest. 6 weeks before that happened, God revealed to a group of praying Christians in Jerusalem, that is going to win the Eurovision Song Contest, so get praying. And they got praying, and they prayed for 6 weeks for that song to come out top. And as you know, it did. I was rather thrilled that the British vote was the last casting vote needed to tip them over the line. But I was appalled at the British contribution, which was so decadent, so lacking in any real culture. Now, why is it that so many spheres of culture in our country are in the hands of the enemy tonight? I'll tell you why. Because Christians have been too spiritual and have not seen the need for culture. God is a most cultural God. Look at the trees He made. They're beautiful, the trees He made, and He made them all, and He only made one of them for a saving, redemptive purpose. He only needed one to save mankind. Why did He make the rest? I'll tell you why. Because He loves making trees. He loves making beautiful trees. But when we get the spiritual and the physical divorced, we can't see the spiritual point in art and culture. What about politics? Dirty word again. Outside the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, stands a great big menorah in bronze. Some of you will have seen it. It is covered with little plaques of Bible scenes. It is a gift from the oldest parliament in the world, ours, to the youngest parliament in the world, Israel's. And looking at it, I just longed for something like that to be given to our parliament by someone and for us to take notice of it. There it is, the biggest words say, not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. And part of that was given by Marks and Spencers in England. And there are plaques of Jacob wrestling and those moments when men met God face to face on that beautiful menorah. It's a most beautiful work of art, but it says something even more. There it is standing outside the parliament just saying, God, God, God. Not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit. I'm glad the Lord led me to write to Mrs. Thatcher. It meant I was the first in England to congratulate her. And she replied very quickly. But I really felt out there, why aren't Christians saying more in politics? Why aren't we speaking to our leaders? Is it because the physical and the spiritual have got too far apart again? Let's take one fourth area. Our worship. Our worship. We're almost embarrassed to use our bodies in worship. Now, we don't use our bodies terribly in speech or conversation either. There's an awful lot of raising up of hands in Israel, but not in worship. That's the way they raise their hands. Sorry about that, but somebody asked, why do Jews have short necks? And they... Somebody else said, why do they have flat foreheads? And but there's a lot of body language out there. And we are almost afraid to use our bodies in worship. We'll stand up, sit down, and possibly take part in the nonconformist crouch for prayer, but somehow to use our bodies in worship. Or let's go a little deeper. There are many evangelical Christians who are really Quakers. They really wouldn't have the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper if it wasn't constantly presented to them by the church. You see, our thinking has got the physical and the spiritual so far apart that we say that the bread and wine and the water of baptism are simply symbols. They're just symbols. The reality is the spiritual thing behind them. That's not the way the Bible talks about sacraments. The Bible talks about the bread and wine and the water as realities, bringing God's grace to you, where the physical and the spiritual are one. And if you take that bread wrongly, you will be physically ill and even die. That's a concept of worship and the sacraments that is very different from the typical spiritualized version. I've given you enough examples from our behavior. Let me give you 4 examples from our beliefs, which show again how far the physical and spiritual can get away from each other. First, our embarrassment with the ministry of healing, and we have to admit that we have difficulties in this area. Somehow, I confess it honestly, I don't know why, but I felt freer to minister to the sick out in Israel. Not just because there were people there whom the Lord had healed 2,000 years ago, but somehow there the physical and the spiritual naturally belong together. And shalom means health as well as peace. And holiness includes wholeness. And this whole area of healing, Lord bless the sick, what do we mean? God is interested in bodies, not just souls. And here is a challenge to our own faith, to my faith. Why don't I get it more together there? A second area of belief, our belief in miracles. We can believe in any miracle provided it's bound in black leather. Have you noticed that? Anything you can read in here and you just say, great, marvelous, believe it? And then you talk to somebody about a modern miracle and real skepticism. For example, the Lord filling cavities of teeth out in Latin America. I'm sure you've read of this. And that people who have no dentist within hundreds of miles, they go to the church and they pray and the Lord fills their teeth. And with such a lovely touch from the Lord, He fills the adults' teeth with silver, but the children's with gold. Isn't that like the Lord? Now, there was a skeptical Anglican chaplain of a school not many miles from here who didn't believe any of it. He couldn't believe that. He could believe that the Lord changed water into wine and fed 5,000 with a few loaves and fish, but filling teeth, no. Couldn't believe it. He went out and he saw this and he got as close to those gaping teeth as he could. And he came back and he wrote an article in Crusade magazine just saying, I have seen and I believe. Now everybody's looking at him and saying, he's going a little losing his critical faculties. Why is there in the Western world this barrier to miracles happening today? I'll tell you, because our whole Greek education system has so separated the physical and the spiritual that we can't see them happening together and affecting each other. And the very concept of the miraculous, in which the supernatural produces a natural result, is something we find difficult. And so we have a kind of compartment in our brain that can cope with any miracle in the Bible, but the rest of our brain cannot cope with miracles today. Not today, not now, not here. And it's part of this separation. A third area in which our faith is affected by this separation is our whole understanding of Israel's future. I find I'm almost a lone voice among many clergy saying, can you not see that God's calling is irrevocable? Can you not see that God still loves the Jews, as Paul says he does? Can you not see that He has not let them go and that He is bringing them back to their land, first in unbelief and then bringing them back to Himself? Can you not see this? The prophets said it clearly that God would bring them back a second time from their second dispersion and bring them back into the land. Can you not see it? What is the response? The response is, oh no. There is only a spiritual Israel now. God no longer deals with physical nations. Yet another example of the separation of the physical and the spiritual. But when you go and see Israel back in its own land and the Hebrew language being spoken again in the streets after 2,000 years, and when you hear of some of the incredible coincidences that have happened, when you hear that Joseph Stalin, after 30 years of anti-Semitic attitude and outrage, after 30 years suddenly changed his mind and for a period of about 3 years supported the establishment of the State of Israel and was the first to recognize her when she was established, and then almost immediately afterwards cooled off. No historian has been able to find a single reason why Stalin changed his mind over that critical period, but there is no doubt that God used Stalin to bring the State of Israel into being. How do you explain this? These and many other things leave us so gasping that I am just left with the conviction, which now cannot be shaken, that God is still interested in physical Israel and still has a spiritual purpose for them. A fourth area concerns Jesus himself. I was speaking to a Catholic lady once, and I said, "Why do you pray to Mary?" And she said, "Because she's human." And I said, "But Jesus is human." "No, he's divine." "No, he's human." "Oh, no, he was human for 33 years, and now he's divine. He's the Lord." Now, I understood something about Catholics then, but I find that many Protestants do not believe that Jesus is still a man. But I tell you, on the authority of the Word of God, there is today, 1979, only one mediator between God and man, the man, Christ Jesus. And we have a high priest in heaven who's not untouched with our infirmities. He is still human. There is a man at God's right hand. There is a man higher than the angels. And his humanity is real. Now, why is it that unbelievers have such difficulty with his deity and believers have such difficulty with his humanity? I'll tell you, because we've got the spiritual and physical too far apart. It's the old thing that we didn't get it together. Now let me come more positively to the amazing fact that our faith, our spiritual faith, is based on physical facts. It is based first on the birth of Jesus, that a teenage girl was made pregnant by the Holy Spirit, and that vital Y chromosome without which that fetus would have been a girl was created by the Holy Creator Spirit. But Jesus' birth was physical. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. His baptism was a physical baptism in the dirty waters of the Jordan River. And he went about doing good because he'd been anointed with the Holy Spirit and with power. And what was most of his doing good? Physical acts for people's bodies, whether healing or feeding or saving them from a storm or whatever. And when he came to do the greatest thing he did for us, he did it physically. And he bore our sins in his body on the tree. On Good Friday, if you were not here, I mentioned that the fact that John records a flow of blood and water from his side when the spear pierced it tells us what we could put on Jesus' death certificate. For now we know what those peculiar symptoms mean. They mean that he died of crucifixion, followed by cardiac rupture. He died of a broken heart. His death was physical. And his burial was physical. And his resurrection was physical. If you were here on Easter Sunday morning, you would remember I told of two groups of people who will accept the spiritual reality of the resurrection, but not the physical. One group are the spiritualists, and they say, "Oh, of course Jesus rose from the dead as a spirit, and he appeared as in a seance to his disciples." But my record says that he said, "Give me some fish," and that he cooked breakfast for them, and he said, "Stop clinging to me, or come and touch me and put your finger through this hole in my hand." His resurrection was physical. The other group are Christian theologians who say that the resurrection stories are simply myths that enshrine the truth that Jesus' influence lived on after his death. Rubbish. Jesus lived on after his death. Up from the grave he arose. And the Christian hope for the future is not based on any immortality of the spirit, but on the resurrection of the body. Indeed, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says that the human spirit is mortal, so God will have to make the human body immortal if he's going to give us eternal life. And when this mortal spirit puts on immortal flesh, then will come to pass the saying that is written, O death, where is thy sting? You see, Christianity is physical through and through. I'm so glad about that when I read some of the other scriptures of great religions, the Holy Vedas or the Al-Quran of the Muslims. You find that they're full of spiritual truths, but there's precious little physical foundation for it. Only in Israel do you get this tremendous sense of wholeness. The physical and the spiritual become one. Life is no longer divided into sacred and secular, what you do on Sunday and what you do on Monday. In spite of the fact that Israel is called a secular state, take my word for it, it is shot through with religion. Shot through. In spite of the fact that only 10% go to the synagogue on Sunday, when they are touched deep down, scratch a sabra beneath that prickly hard outside, and you'll find a sweet belief in God in at least 3/4 of them underneath. I was talking to one of our guides about this. He had been passionately describing his willingness to die for his country because he said, I know that Jewish soldiers, Israeli soldiers, will risk their lives to bring my dead body back, even if some of them die doing so. And passionately he said, you see, we don't leave our dead, we bring them back to bury them. And incidentally, there isn't a crematorium in Israel. The body is too important. They bring them back. Do you know that Mrs. Bloch, who was cruelly murdered under Idi Amin, you remember the lady who was on the hijacked aircraft? Do you know that an African orderly nurse at risk of his life kept her clothes, and they have brought the clothes back to Mrs. Bloch's family to be buried? It's something. It's something physical. It's the same feeling that Mary had when she thought she'd met the gardener outside the empty tomb, and she said, Sir, if you put him somewhere else, show me where you've laid him and I'll come and get him. Him, I want him. There is this strong physical sense. The body is very, very important. Indeed, a living soul in Hebrew means a breathing body. And when Jesus said, what shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul, he wasn't meaning what shall it profit a man if he gets well on in business and stops going to church. He means what shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world and stops breathing? It's all dead loss then. He'll have to leave it all behind. And a living soul in Genesis 2 describes man as a breathing body. The physical and the spiritual are so united that the Hebrew couldn't possibly consider a full life without a body. And on that basis, the future hope of the Christian is the resurrection of the body. I'm looking forward to shaking hands in heaven with you. I don't want to go to a state of spiritual inertia where I drift around and sort of drift through you in passing and say, hello, goodbye. I don't want that. I want to be able to come up to you in heaven and say, hello again. Wonderful to shake hands again. You will have hands in heaven. Let's try and round this off. You see, what I'm really saying is that creation and redemption belong together. But in the West, we find it very difficult getting them together. We either major on creation and get thoroughly materialistic, or we get major on redemption and become terribly or too spiritual. But even for the secular Jew, religion and life mix. We went to a nightclub with the second group for Israeli folklore. And there in the nightclub we listened to songs about the Messiah and songs taken straight from the Bible. Where else would that happen? I don't know of any other place you can hear that in nightclubs. Those Israeli soldiers on their way to Entebbe to rescue the hostages, do you know what they sang? They sang Psalm 133 all the way. Hinema Tov Nanaim. How wonderful and pleasant it is for brothers to live together in unity. And the Bible is so much part of life, going through the artist colony, looking at the tapestries, the paintings, the silver sculptures. Somebody just said to me, isn't it amazing? Over half of these works of art are inspired by the Bible. Take me to the new Tate Gallery. I'll show you heaps of bricks and stones and other rubbish that people call art, but you show me how much in that new wing of the Tate Gallery has been inspired by the realities of God's Word. They might have a sacred room of sacred art, and you see what we've done? Put the secular art here, the sacred art there, it's just not got it together. And one of the exciting things is to find that Chaim, life, is just a wholeness which brings everything in. whereby work becomes worship, and every Israeli is on a 6-day week. 6 days shalt thou labor, and they still do. And I believe they're a healthier society for doing so. They have less spare time, yes, but their work is part of the wholeness of life. They find meaning and purpose in their work. It's not just the necessary evil to get money to enjoy yourself in your leisure time. It's part of life. Chaim. This is why Jews over the ages have been so prominent in science and medicine, particularly medicine. It's because they've been so practical, so this worldly, so concerned about people's bodies. This is why somebody says that the Mosaic Law in the first 5 books of the Bible is one of the finest treatises on hygiene and preventative medicine there has ever been. Because God was concerned with all of life. He was as much concerned with dry rot as you know, Don. It's dealt with in the book of Leviticus. He's as much concerned with dry rot in your floor as he is in rot in the heart. Life is all of a piece. As we drove past a Jewish cemetery, I just saw the name of it. Eretz HaChaim, land of life. And I said to a Jewish man who was near me, why is that called land of life? Well, he said, one day the bodies are going to rise to meet the Messiah. That's why. And somehow the whole of life seemed to bring the physical in. Let me go a little further still. When did you last hear a preacher preach a sermon about the new earth? The new earth. For every 100 sermons you'll hear about heaven in the Western world, you might hear one about the new earth, right? And yet if you read the last book in the Bible, you'll find that it is God's amazing plan and purpose to redeem this physical universe. And this whole universe has gone wrong, and it's groaning and traveling, waiting for one thing. It's waiting for the redemption of my body. And then the whole universe can be recreated, because my body will need a new place to live in and a new earth to walk around in. And so God's purpose is to redeem the physical universe. And I'm looking forward to seeing that new earth and seeing just what it's like. Now, when I go to Israel, I can believe in a new earth. When I go there, the physical and spiritual are so close that I get the right perspective. Life becomes whole, and therefore in a position to be holy. It's interesting that the Jewish religion has never led to asceticism. It has not led to monasteries or celibacy. It has upheld family life, marriage. It has upheld the enjoyment of God's gifts. And that strand goes right through into the New Testament. Jesus himself was not an ascetic. They called him a glutton and a winebibber. But Jesus didn't mind. As Paul was later to say, God has given us all things freely to enjoy. What a lovely world he's put us in. To develop, to master, to turn the desert into a garden, to bring in their latest scheme water from the Mediterranean through to the Dead Sea. That's the latest scheme, to drive a tunnel through, to bring water through into the Dead Sea. That'll make it more fresh. It'll also make electricity in the tunnel. But it also answers a question. The prophet Ezekiel said that one day the Dead Sea would be full of all the species of fish in the Mediterranean. I wondered how on earth they were going to get there. They'll be there over the next year or two. It is astonishing, this practical, down-to-earth. People tell me sometimes I'm much too literal interpreting the Bible, but you know, once you go to Israel, the whole thing comes down to earth with a bump. It becomes real. If you ask me what it does for your faith, the Lord can earth your faith in Israel. That's why some people go out and are disappointed, because when they get there, they expect a whole lot of stained glass windows and lovely, beautiful Christmas card scenes, and suddenly they smell camels. And they see the filthy streets in Arab souk in Jerusalem. Somehow it's not quite so glamorous. They're being earthed, because it was to a smelly, dirty earth that the Son of God came. He didn't come into a stained glass window. He came into life as it was, the world as it is. And he affirmed life. He affirmed life more than anyone else. He came to bring life and bring it more abundantly. L'chaim. He didn't turn water into tomato juice, as you well know. He came to bring life and cheer. He came to affirm the physical. as part of the spiritual. And the appeal of the Bible is to be physical and spiritual at the same time. It is to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, which is your spiritual worship. It is to remember that one day you will give an account to God for the things done in the body. Christianity is the most materialistic religion of all world religions. That's the thing that Israel does for my faith whenever I go. A Sunday school superintendent said to me once, "I can pick out every Sunday school teacher you've had to Israel." And I said, "How do you do that? Are they showing things they brought back, or are they beginning every other sentence when I was in?" And he said, No, I don't pick them out that way. I said, "How do you pick them out?" He said, "Shall I tell you? Everyone who's been to Israel tells the Bible story with the same tone of voice with which they would describe yesterday's football match. The others all put on an unnatural tone." Now that may sound very simple to you, but it's a very profound comment. Their faith had been earthed. It was now in the realm of the real. The physical and the spiritual were together, and life was more of a whole. And you could talk about these things with the same tone of voice as you talk about a football match. That's my great burden to share with you tonight. We live in a disintegrating society, and one of the main reasons for that is precisely that the physical and the spiritual have got too far apart. And so we are denying the unity of the whole man, physical, mental, emotional, social, spiritual. The whole man, this living soul who is a breathing body in Hebrew thinking. We've lost sight of the great purposes of redemption, which is not just to get my soul into heaven and put a harp in its hand if it has a hand, but to redeem my body and put me in a new heaven and a new earth where I can enjoy forever the things that God has made. That's a whole new ball game. It's a whole new understanding. And those of you who've been to Israel, will you please seek to share with others this understanding of the wholeness of life, so that the physical and the spiritual are again put together, and the Word becomes flesh in your life, and your faith becomes incarnate in a very practical holiness that touches what you eat and what you drink, and how you talk, how you relate socially, and the hobbies you have and the work you do. All these things become part of godly living if you've understood my message tonight. The Word became flesh and spent 18 years making chairs and tables and doors, and 3 years preaching and teaching and healing. How unbalanced, Lord? No, that's what it's all about.